Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I am the webinar producer for today's conversation. The webinar will be recorded and shared with you afterwards, but we invite you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third, and on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's conversation, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share any reflections, questions, and observations on social media. And as we get started, I just have a few housekeeping details. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here, and feel free to share your thoughts and insights throughout the duration of the webinar. We also encourage you to post any questions that you may have in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to respond to any questions that you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook Live. A link to the recording, as well as any resources, slides, and speaker bios will be shared and emailed on Friday to all who registered. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation poll during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we start, I wanted to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on February 20th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a funder-to-funder conversation at 12:30 Eastern Time, which will focus on scaling teacher PD for student success within the reading universe. That same day at 3 p.m., we'll have a conversation on how summer learning's resurgence and maximization has accelerated in-school learning. On the 27th, we'll wrap up the month of February with a conversation on international teacher development for improved student outcomes. Registration links and more information on these sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. And joining you now is Hattie Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you.
Thanks, Sierra. Hi, everyone. Welcome to everyone joining us today for this conversation around the science of reading for emergent bilinguals. I'm really excited to hear from all of our panelists today, as I know you all are, so I'm going to jump right into introductions. Our speakers today are Elsa Cardenas Hagen, who is president of Valley Speech Language and Learning Center. We have Claude Goldenberg, who is Professor Emeritus of Education at Stanford University. Marta Hernandez is the Executive Director of Californians Together. And we have a few more speakers joining us as well. On the next slide, we have Carrie Curto, National Science of Reading Project Director with the Reading League, and Magali Lavadens, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Equity for English Learners. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Julie Sugarman, who is the Associate Director for K-12 Education Research at the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome, Julie, and thank you for moderating this conversation today.
Thanks, Hattie. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here today, and I want to welcome everybody who's joining us, our panelists, and all of our guests who are watching today. I am really excited to be talking with you about this topic. I think we're in for a fascinating conversation because our topic really allows us to think deeply both about the technical details of pedagogy, but also the real profound questions around how people learn, the contributions and limitations of education research, and what are the appropriate roles of educators, administrators, and policymakers at all levels of the system in making decisions about curriculum and instruction. Today's webinar represents an ongoing conversation within our field about the complex issues surrounding literacy education. It also marks a continuation of a collaboration between experts from the Reading League and the National Committee on Effective Literacy. And of course, we're really excited to hear all of your thoughts as we get into the conversation and see what you're writing in the chat and what you put in the Q&A box for us to answer at the end of the period. Before we get started, I just want to, on behalf of the panelists, thank Hattie Miles-Polka and the whole campaign for grade level reading staff for pulling this together, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity. So I want to go ahead and welcome our panelists to join us on video so we can see your beautiful faces, in addition to hearing your fascinating words. And here we all are. Great. Well, I want to start with a little bit of context today. Last October, the Reading League and National Committee for Effective Literacy released a joint statement on the science of reading and emergent bilingual students. Carrie and Martha, as lead authors of the statement, could you talk us through how this statement came about, its main ideas, and the overall goal for its release?
So I'm going to begin. And so in the beginning, a group of English learner researchers and educators from across the country became concerned because multilingual learners were notably absent from literacy conversations and in the development of literacy policy and legislation. And also the narrative, had focused on a narrow definition of the science of reading as a focus predominantly on foundational reading skills and phonics. So we saw that missing was the comprehensive set of elements that are essential in literacy and biliteracy development and are critical for English learners. And so it was in response to these gaps that we came together to form the National Committee for Effective Literacy, NCEL. So we were concerned about the nationwide implementation of practices really labeled under the science of reading. So NCEL developed a white paper. We held a national webinar and entered into the national dialogue about policies based on what is understood in public terms as the science of reading. So Carrie?
Yeah, thanks, Martha. We're going to go back and forth because we're so great at communicating at this point. So when the white paper came out, there were a lot of reactions from folks in the reading science community. Some folks were upset by some of what they saw were mischaracterizations of the science of reading that they thought might halt some of the progress that they had been seeing. There was a response to the white paper that was offered by Claude Goldenberg and Linda Diamond, which is linked on the Reading League Compass. But we knew that more had to be done, right? These accusations or these understandings must be coming from somewhere. So we wanted to connect and we wanted to learn more. So we offered an invitation for a virtual conversation with members of NCEL, and we were grateful that they were accepted. We also invited friends of the Reading League to participate. We started out by understanding each other's why, which helped to kind of disarm everyone and break us out of our echo chambers. And we then set up more meetings over the summer of 2022, during which we asked some brave questions and we worked to understand how to find alignment, which, spoiler alert, was not actually as hard as we thought in many, many areas. And these conversations led to last year's Reading League Summit in Las Vegas. Those videos can also be found on the Reading League Compass campus on the ELEB page, if anyone is interested in hearing those conversations. And I'll say for me personally, I did not know the outcome of that day when we all came together for the first time. It was a little nerve-wracking, but at the end of the day, I think that more trust had been built. You know, hands were shaken. I even saw some high fives, I think. Understandings were built, and I think that the division was on its way to being healed. So Martha, what was the summit like from NCEL's perspective?
Well, I do have to say that there was tension, no doubt about it. And of course, it was truly a journey, a process centered around building relationships and trust. So Carrie invited us to participate in the Reading League Summit, but not just as participants. She asked us for panelist suggestions, and she invited me to provide opening remarks and actually share the stage with her. I do have to admit, I was terrified to address a room of 500 people with a different lens and belief. But we found that many in the room shared the same concerns about emergent bilingual students. There was a powerful moment for me when it was emphasized that English learners should not be an afterthought or addendum in the development of any literacy initiatives. And there was collective applause in the room, which really underscored the importance of prioritizing the needs of English learners and shaping effective literacy strategies. And so we basically focused on a few areas of oral language, foundational skills, policy, and neuroscience, which are the areas highlighted in the joint statement. And so, Carrie, do you want to describe the joint statement?
Yeah, so after this remarkable day in Las Vegas, the joke was we didn't want to let what happened in Vegas stay in Vegas this time. So Martha, with some help from Shelley Spiegel-Coleman and other friends that are here today, other panelists, decided that we needed another concrete outcome from the summit. We couldn't let the messaging just reach the audience that was in attendance. So we worked through last summer to draft the statement. And through these conversations, I think we had those same aha moments that folks at the summit had. NCEL shared specific aspects of instruction that they felt that they had seen in classrooms that were being done under the name of the science of reading. And we said, hey, guess what? That's not the science of reading. And we also agree that what they're doing is not backed by research. So we felt the need to write these down, call out the practices that we all understood to not be beneficial to students, particularly ELEB students. And we've been really pleased with the outcome and the comments on how useful this collaborative document is. And I'll hand it over to Martha to share more.
So I just want to highlight that the joint statement underscores the practices that are not aligned with the science, such as, you know, a one-size-fits-all singular science of reading curriculum. You know, there is a need to differentiate. There is a need to teach foundational skills in a manner that's authentic to the language of instruction. Another unsupported practice highlighted in the statement is the abandonment of English language development or English as a second language, in some cases in favor of providing additional interventions for foundational skills. And the statement cautions against neglecting the essential components such as oral language development, primary language support and instruction, knowledge in the content areas, for the sake of a literacy block that's primarily focused on foundational word reading skills. And it advocates for allocating time in the school day for access to all content areas. And so also not supported is a focus on phonics or decoding for an extended period of time that doesn't include instruction in other subcomponents of language and literacy. And something that for us is very important, the statement underscores that it is not acceptable to provide little or no attention to ELD and biliteracy. You know, ELD is a partner to literacy for English learners. It's core curriculum for English learners. And in terms of biliteracy, we know that English learners do best when they're in some form of bilingual setting. They do best at everything, you know, they do best at maintaining their home language, at learning English over time, and in academic subjects. And so in addition, the statement raises concerns about professional development that addresses emergent bilingual students superficially. advocating instead for a more comprehensive training that delves really deeply into their particular needs. And, I just want to say also that it calls out the practice of assigning, multilingual learner students to foundational skills interventions without really addressing other areas of literacy as informed by data from assessments that are linguistically and culturally appropriate. And so, Carrie, what are some of the ways you've seen the joint statement used?
Well, it's been really neat to do these webinars with you, Martha, because we've heard from schools and districts that have used it in their settings. They've said that it's refreshing and helpful to have clear guidance that's not in conflict of one another. I think that it's nice to have something that can address some of the misconceptions that these knowledge building professional learning offerings are somehow programs, that the science of reading does not include vocabulary or writing or language, right? I think teachers are already so overwhelmed and overburdened that it's been helpful to relieve that stress of their colleagues assuming some sort of negative intent of what they're doing. And so I hope to see it still continue these conversations in schools. I've also heard from ed prep programs, faculty from higher education have begun to incorporate aspects of it into their course content, both in MLL specialist programs and in elementary education and special education. So I see it as an opportunity to break down those silos. And I hope that folks in the call will think about how they could do the same. Also, I've heard from at least one state Department of Education that's used this as a resource to develop guidance, which has been really exciting. How about you, Martha?
Well, I've heard similar uses. Districts are discussing how their practices are aligned or not with the joint statement. And I've heard someone that is actually going to be using it in her dissertation. But I do have to shine the light that there has been, I would say, like some misuse of the statement by, a few publishers that focus on the fact that bilingual advocates support explicit systematic phonics, while ignoring the other parts of the statement that uplift a comprehensive approach. So, it's really important to uplift all the aspects of the statement and act upon it. It's really my hope that the joint statement helps guide practitioners towards literacy education that embraces multilingual learners, and that all of the science be embraced and applied to inform instruction, complemented, of course, by understanding and addressing, the social, linguistic, and cultural factors that impact students. That's also included in the joint statement.
Thanks, Martha. And I have seen the same from different angles. So yeah, just another call to action. Let's not just take one or two sentences from any document and use it to explain the whole thing, right? So thanks for sharing that. I think overall, just I would call upon everybody here to use this to continue conversations towards alignment. Let's disrupt the divisiveness or vilifying something that that has data behind it that works for kiddos. We also have other future opportunities. You'll get the links to that, I believe, after the webinar, but we have a community of practice, a collegial community that will come together and continue these conversations. We have another Reading League Summit coming up at the end of April. It's starting to get close to selling out, so check that out. And then visit, the Reading League Compass ELEB page. You can download it in English or in Spanish. And I would love to hear from you all as to other ways that you think you can use this statement throughout the webinar. It would be fascinating to hear in the chat one thing you can do to help this ideal coming together a reality.
Great. Thank you so much, both Martha and Carrie. That was both fascinating story, and of course, no surprise that it was a preview of things to come in this conversation today, of a lot of really important topics that we're going to get into a little bit more deeply. And so we're going to actually turn now to some of the research and topics that you were discussing. The dialogue between the Reading League and NCEL has had a strong focus on bringing together research from a variety of fields. For Magali, Claude, and Elsa, Elsa. I know you're all well-versed across these areas, but I hope you might tell us one or two key insights from research in your fields. So first to Magali on language and literacy development for emergent bilinguals, and then Claude on how children learn to read, and Elsa on struggling bilingual readers. And I'll just let you go from one to the next within this question. So Magali, please.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Carrie and Martha, for setting the stage in the context of what we've agreed upon in terms of the principles for language and literacy development. That's in the white paper in the Common Ground statement as well. One of the things that I think needs to be underscored, implicit in the statements and in the research, is the importance of recognizing that children come to school, emergent bilingual English learners come to school with a rich repertoire of home languages that can and should be built upon. That they should not be ignored as they learn how to speak, read, and write in English, their second language. This asset space is really confirmed so much by the brain research about how the quote-unquote superpower inherent in bilinguals in the early years and across the lifespan is something that we really need to take advantage of. And those cross-linguistic, those meaning-making opportunities for even young children in learning how English works, how to speak in English, and that this can be connected in oral language development in the early grades and across the grade spans as well. So that as we develop oral language, background knowledge for our young children, we do it in meaningful ways that engages them in the act of reading in a way that supports and continues their growth and development in learning to read in English. We also agreed upon the fact that a comprehensive instructional program begins with oral language development, that we know that for native English speakers, they come ready to read in their home language. And yet that connection and building upon background knowledge building in context, learning about vocabulary in context and not in isolation, helps young learners make sense of their new language in ways that are really effective and contextualized. So when we're teaching young children foundational skills to make sense of text, helps them to make sense and meaning in terms of the context of real world, real words, real text in context. This is also connected to a point that was made previously that the best literacy outcomes for young children are programs that are bilingual or dual language in nature, and that learning to read in their home language it yields higher outcomes, higher literacy outcomes for those children who have that access. And yet the majority of our English learners are not in bilingual dual language programs. So we want to be able to encourage the home language to continue to develop simultaneously. They can do that at home with reading and speaking in those home languages. A critical point is about English language development as part of that comprehensive instructional program. That is, for a certain amount of time, a limited block of time where well-prepared teachers are supported to deliver how the knowledge of how English works. And that how English works is a component of a comprehensive instructional program for English learners, using those cross-linguistic abilities and the knowledge that students already possess. Claude, you go next.
Oh, okay, it's my turn. I
Yes.
didn't know you were finished. Thank you,
Yes.
Magali. And thank you to the coalition, to Hattie, to Julie, and to all the panelists. Really, I'm going to try to curb my enthusiasm, but I think this is a wonderful opportunity to do what Martha and Harry helped spearhead, having these conversations. Full disclosure, not all disagreements have been resolved. I mean, this is a dynamic and active field of exploration, of knowledge, of professional growth, scientific advances. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that, there's still issues. I mean, it'd be a dead field if there weren't still issues. But the importance of really recognizing common areas of agreement to build on, I think can't be overstated. So there's an awful lot to say on this topic that Julie asked the three of us to address. But what I want to focus on is what I think is most critical for learners in general and English learners, emergent bilinguals, we have different terms, multilingual learners. We tend to use them interchangeably. They all mean something somewhat different, but we kind of use them as the same thing. So I'll just say English learners. So I think what's most critical for learners in general, English learners in particular, is that I think we can claim that we know from classroom and neurolinguistic research that in order to become literate, individuals have to make connections between the sounds of the language, the phonemes, the phonology, and how those sounds are visually represented in print, called the orthography, and then how those sound and symbol connections then connect to meaning. The neuroscientists call this the reading circuit or the literacy circuit. And that is like really non-negotiable. You got to create that circuitry in order to become literate. The neuroscientists also call this making the oral language system accessible to the visual system, because we are intuitively attuned to oral language, to human speech. It's something that gets most attention from newborns, right? They orient to human speech. Not so with written language. Oral language comes in through the ear and comes out through your mouth. And, absent some developmental anomaly, some developmental delay, it's kind of natural to human beings. You're surrounded by oral language. You will learn it. You will acquire it. You will be able to speak it. But it's different with print. We're not born knowing how to process print. Print is a fairly recent human invention, about maybe 5,000 years ago, or for orthograph or alphabetic language, it's even more recent, 3,500 years ago. But oral language transmitted through human speech is as old as the human species, 300,000 years roughly, give or take 5, 10, 50,000. So we have to create this brain circuitry. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've read some of them. I've talked to them. I've talked to Ken Pugh and Stanislas Dehaene. I've listened to his presentations and read his publications. You have to create this brain circuitry in order to learn to read. And this is true whether you're a monolingual, bilingual, trilingual, whether you're learning to read in your first language, your second language, your nth language. This brain circuitry has got to be created. And the classroom and home conditions about to be created to promote this, to make this circuitry strong and robust. Now, that's true universally. However, if you're learning to read and write in a language you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, that's the situation faced by English learners who are learning to read and write in an English medium environment, which is what most English learners are in, unfortunately. There's no daylight between my colleagues and myself about the advantages of bilingual education. And one of the advantages is that if you're learning to read in a language you already know, you just have to learn the orthography, the spelling system. I say only kind of ironically because that is a challenge more for some than for others. But if you're learning to read and to write in a language that you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, you need additional support in English language development so that you learn the phonology, the sound system of the language you're learning, so you learn the semantics, the meaning system of the language that you're learning, so that as you learn the orthography, the writing system, you can attach the writing system to the sound system, to the semantic system. And if English learners, if you're learning to read and to write in a language that you're learning, you need that additional support. Otherwise, learning to become literate is extremely difficult. Some might even say impossible. So the takeaway here is that there are some universals that are musts for learning to become literate, connecting the sounds, the symbols to meaning. That has got to happen. And if you are learning the language simultaneously, you need to be provided additional instructional support so that you learn the phonology, the sounds, and the semantics, the meanings, as you're learning the writing system. That to me is the most important thing to take away in the education, the literacy education of English learners who are learning to read and write in English. They're also learning to understand and speak the language.
Thanks, Claude. So I'd like to talk a little bit about students who struggle with reading, and I want to bring out the myth that students who struggle with reading, it's a myth that they can't be biliterate, because yes, they can, because they have an intact brain, just like each of us. And as Claude mentioned, that, our brains are pre-wired and ready for language. If you touch your left side over here, that, left hemisphere, that left temporal parietal lobe, that's your language center. But Claude's mentioning about what do you have to do? You have to make the connectors to that print. And what happens for students who struggle and who have this risk for reading disabilities. And if we look at, well, reading entails that language comprehension, but you have to have those foundational skills of decoding. And some students will have, great language comprehension, but can't decode. And others will have terrible decoding and can't comprehend. And some will have problems in both areas. And so one of the things that I want to point out to, no matter if you only demonstrate, like oftentimes children with dyslexia have a lot of trouble with decoding, but when you are learning an additional language to become multi-literate, what happens is you cannot forget the language components. You have to be addressing the oral language as you're working on those foundational skills. And what I want to say is our intervention work began in, 24 years ago. 24 years ago, the Biliteracy Research Network. And in these studies, these intervention studies, we did these studies both in English, and in Spanish. So some of them were learning Spanish, some of them were learning English. And I heard Magali talk about those cross-linguistic features, absolutely. But you cannot do the work in your interventions without those oral language and literacy supports. And we talk about that very extensively and systematically. And oftentimes we are concerned that the students aren't getting enough of a comprehensive intervention. And what we see here, and Claude talked about some of the areas we maybe have some future work to do and more work to do in the research world, is making sure that we have the right kind of tools to figure out, why do we even test a child? We test so that we can know what is it that they know, and we test for instruction. And Jack Fletcher always says, teach, test, right? And so what's important is knowing and understanding the student, what has been their language and language of opportunity. And oftentimes we forget about our families and the context. Children bring so much to the table when they enter that classroom. But do you know your student? Do you know their context? Do you know what has been their home language? Do you know what has been their opportunity for learning? And has there been some consistency in that opportunity? And as you heard Martha say, we know that students that get that home language and home language literacy will do better in multiple languages and multiple literacies. And in our country, we only do English. The majority of children are serviced in English medium. We do see some increase in those dual language. But what I want to say is we have to be, in our studies and interventions, we were able to have great success in both the oracy, that oral language, that vocabulary, as well as those foundational skills. And too often when we go and we see what's going on, we don't want to see this, everything so siloed and it's connected: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We can't forget that. But at the foundation of that is language. And that language supports literacy, and literacy supports language. So when we have both, one complements the other. And I want to say that we need the professionals to be able and be ready to have that opportunity to understand what is a learning disability, what are, have they had all those opportunities and all these variables. And I wrote an entire fact sheet about it on IDA dyslexia, about all the things you need to have in place for measuring these students who are at risk for these learning difficulties. But the majority of kids, 90% of them, 95% of them, they're going to be able to learn when they have a very qualified professional there following the evidence of what we know today.
Fantastic. Thank you all so very much. And another theme that comes out really strongly in the joint statement is that the science of reading isn't a single program or a single set of strategies, but it's rather a comprehensive body of knowledge. And that's already come up a couple of times in our conversation today. But there are some curriculum and professional development providers that claim that their programs are the best way or the only way to implement the science of reading in classrooms. So why was it important to acknowledge this issue in the statement? Martha, I'll go to you first, and then we'll go to Carrie and Claude. But I'll come back in to push us along. Martha, you're on mute.
So sorry about that.
Sorry.
And so it was very critical for us to include in the joint. It was very critical because the science of reading is frequently branded and misrepresented by the media and by some publishers and a few professional development organizations. The science of reading is represented as a focus on phonics and as a curriculum or program. And there exists a research to implementation gap. You often hear about districts and states who have adopted the science of reading, and we all know that the science of reading can't be adopted. What it means is that they have adopted a phonics-based program. And so with the joint statement, we are together, dispelling this prevalent misconception surrounding the science of reading and clarifying and building an understanding that it is not a one-size-fits-all approach, a rigid instructional program solely focused on phonics, even though the media and professional development organizations and publishers may have us believe otherwise. I think we need to rebrand that the science of reading includes all science, including the extensive research on effective literacy for multilingual learners. It was necessary to flag that the science does not promote a phonics only or a phonics first approach. And so we need to encourage publishers and professional learning organizations to address, consider, include, and present a comprehensive approach to literacy that incorporates considerations for second language learners and not just a focus on one or two components. Addressing English learners as an addendum is just not acceptable. Unfortunately, the narrow, simplified definition excludes the essential components, which includes emphasizing oral language, providing dedicated time for English language development, recognizing the significance of content knowledge, and really appreciating the benefits of biliteracy, and leveraging the rich, really linguistic and cultural assets that multilingual learners bring to school, which Elsa so eloquently made a statement about. Sometimes school decision makers face the difficult task of translating knowledge into practice, in the middle of teacher burnout, declining enrollment, diminishing budgets, the plethora of initiatives, so it makes them susceptible to prioritizing options that appear simple, time-saving, and cost-effective. So despite really good intentions, leaders may mistakenly believe that the practices they are implementing align with the findings from the comprehensive science of reading, when in fact they do not. And sometimes the instructional practices may actually be in opposition to what the research is really indicating. We know that no single approach works optimally for all students. Effective literacy instruction needs to be responsive and differentiated. So commercial programs and professional development must address all components of literacy development for emerging bilingual students and should consider the role of culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy. There is a quote in the joint statement, that says, comprehensive literacy instruction encompassing the vast body of scientific knowledge cannot be packaged into a single program box or presentation. So.
Great. Thank you, Martha. Carrie, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would love to, because to me, this is one of the most exciting items to uplift from the statement, right? We're turning this corner and sweeping those misconceptions under the rug and understanding the science of reading as a body of knowledge. That's one of my favorite paragraphs right there in paragraph 2. Check it out. And I would say that the Reading League has really been trying to get this word out pretty much since its inception. We developed the defining guide, we developed the curriculum evaluation guidelines years ago, because as we started to hear this buzz of the science of reading taking off, this term taking off, we saw the sticker effect. And I think you all know what I mean, right? Tokenism, publishers, developers, others, sometimes well-intended, right? But they would stick a science of reading sticker right on their product. And sometimes these were very attractive stickers. So I think what happened is as educators and leaders began to build their knowledge then in the science of reading and evidence-based practices, then they started to see holes in these materials that they were sold, right? They saw the red flags and the practices that they were coming to understand were actually misaligned to the scientific evidence of how kids learn to read. Okay, but I want to say there are great instructional materials out there. At TRL, however, we are completely program curriculum agnostic. We see ourselves as knowledge brokers. And I think that's what's really important, right? Is that knowledge must first be built before agreeing to materials, if possible. Sometimes I say knowledge construction before instruction. If you build an understanding of reading research, which by the way, was not part of my educator preparation program, nor that of many of my colleagues out there. And if you expand that knowledge to understand how to develop an evidence-aligned system, right, including how to use data to inform instruction, the role of coaching, the role of implementation science, then you are much less susceptible to that science of reading sticker, right? And one thing I'd like to just briefly clarify is that this does, in fact, as my colleagues are saying, include knowledge of all reading research. This means we can't leave out the research on how to teach students with language-based learning differences, students with dyslexia, and students with developmental language disorder. We can't leave out the research on how to support students with dialectical differences. And we absolutely, of course, cannot leave out the research of the huge percentage of our student population that are English learners and emergent bilingual students. We have a lot of this research that is compiled on the Reading League Compass ELEB page if you're interested in reading it. For example, some of Linnea Aries' research, some of Elsa Cardenas-Higgins' research, and Sharon Vaughn's research, and also I think one of the most influential research reports, the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Students and Youth. We noticed it was not available to download at no cost on the internet, so we bought the rights. And so you can go to the ELEB page of the Reading League Compass and put in your information and download a copy. We have it for the next 3 years. So let's attend to all of the research, how all students learn to read and write. Let's use that to be smarter than our curriculum, to know where our instructional materials align with the evidence, to know when it's misaligned, especially when it's so misaligned that it would be a waste of instructional time, which is so precious, and that it would leave students behind. And when we can continue to use our materials, but address and refine those noticed gaps, we can leverage the most powerful tool that we have, in my opinion, which is teacher and leader knowledge.
Fantastic. And Claude, would you please let us know what you think about this?
Thank you, Julie. I'd be happy to. So, again, this is such an important conversation, and part of the challenge for us is to sort of keep all this in mind. I mean, to use a cliche, there are a lot of moving parts here, and I keep thinking of the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant, and the science of reading or reading research is like this big elephant. I mean, there's a lot to it, a lot of parts to it. And sometimes I think we're all groping around, and some of us like to hang on to the trunk, and some of us like the tusks. And others think the tail is really what matters, and it's going to wag the elephant or something. And the challenge is really to keep all that in mind, and a sense of proportion and a sense of priority. And it's really very, very difficult. So I think we need to acknowledge the challenge for teachers and for policymakers, and then for the rest of us who are trying to grapple with how to make this body of knowledge comprehensive, comprehensible, and accessible. But I want to go back to what I was saying about this brain circuitry that needs to be constructed. I mean, I think, I mean, I can say with a fair amount of certainty that there's a lot of really good evidence that this brain circuitry has got to be constructed one way or another in order for literacy to be enabled. But knowing that is one thing, and knowing how to accomplish that is another. Is a difference between the science of reading and the science of teaching reading, right? And that's a distinction that sometimes goes unacknowledged. So the question is, how do we increase the likelihood that those strong connections are made among the sounds of the language, the symbols that represent those sounds, and the meaning system of the language? How do we, that's a science of teaching reading question, not a science of reading question, a science of teaching reading. How do we increase the likelihood that circuitry gets built? It's robust, it's strong, and it creates a foundation for ongoing and later literacy development. I think the evidence is quite clear that explicit and systematic instruction is your best bet. Now, this is not to say by any means that phonics is the only thing you need to learn to read. I mean, I want to distance myself from that position as far as I possibly can. Lots of other things are important, even essential, and we've heard about those. And we can't lose sight of those either. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that whether you're an English learner or a non-English learner learning your first, second, third language, explicit and systematic instruction has got to be part of the mix. Now, some kids need more, some kids need less. English learners, as I've said, need additional ELD support because they're learning the sounds and the meaning system of the language. And again, some will need more, some will need less. I mean, diversity is simultaneously the bane of our existence, but part of the joy of teaching. The diversity of kids the assets they bring, the strengths that they need, and the instructional needs that they bring to us. So we have to have curriculum instruction that increases the likelihood that brain circuitry is constructed. And explicit, systematic instruction in those foundational skills is essential, as is all these other things that people are talking about. But it's a big, big pot of ingredients and elements that we need to think about and carry forward.
Thank you so much, Claude, and everyone. I think that everyone in the audience must be feeling a little bit overwhelmed at this point. We have gone into touching on just a number, as Claude said with the metaphor of the elephant, touching on a number of really important areas. As I said at the beginning, you know, this gets into really profound questions of what does it mean to learn? What do we know about the brain? You know, what do we know from research? What can we say in certain contexts and not in other contexts? And I think you know, having this foundation of understanding the complexity of where all of the research traditions are coming from and contributing to our knowledge has been just an amazing first half of, or first maybe 3/5, since I have 5 questions of this conversation. And I want to talk a little bit, the last 2 questions are a little bit more closer to the ground, but still dealing with some pretty profound questions related to this about literacy not being a single program. What are the necessary systems and supports that have to be in place to help teachers incorporate best practices for emergent bilinguals and differentiate literacy instruction for their students' diverse needs? Elsa, we'll go to you, and then when you're done, I'll pass to Magali.
So, Julie, thanks for passing it over to me. This is where I live, on the ground, in the classrooms. Let's see how we're going to make this work. Let's see how we're going to put the research to practice. But I really love what was in the chat box. You know, we've been talking about the science of reading. That's our why, right? And I saw in the chat box somebody put, but what about the science of leading this whole process? Which is also, we haven't gotten to talk about that. Where's the science of that? And what I'd like to point out too is that what's so important is, you know, the science of reading is that body of evidence and interdisciplinary evidence, right? And when we talk about that term structured literacy, that's the how we're going to get, and it must be comprehensive. And so now, there's a new info map on that at the International Dyslexia Association website, because too many people were doing what Martha's saying, oh, it's only this. And we do structured literacy, and Martha's talking about, oh, it was only phonics, and it wasn't comprehensive, and it wasn't, considering, very tightly that language component. But what I want to say is that we did a lot of work on really talking about the framework of multi-tiered systems of support, right? But through the lens of English learners, these multilingual students. And really at that MTSS4L's website, what we had was just like a rubric to reflect upon yourselves, looking at the leadership that I just saw in that chat box, that leadership, do the leaders know, do they know? They have to know so many things, but do our leaders really understand what we're talking about here? And it takes a strong leader that's going to work with their teachers and do that collaboration. And when I look at, who are some of the most successful countries and in literacy, and how are they doing this work with multi-literacy, they first have a leader, and they're anchored in really prioritizing and making sure that they have, like Martha says, we don't want to be afterthoughts. Like I always say too, don't give me the crumbs off the table. Let me be at the very center of this conversation. And these students who are multilingual, students with dialectal variations, all diverse students with, learning difficulties, we all need to be at that table. But what I want to say is, we have to put these systems in place, and that does include knowing your students. So having some tools available, some screening tools that will tell us about, where are our children? And they're not for diagnosis, they're for that ability to teach, because that's what we want. And we want to make sure also that we have that opportunity for that ongoing professional development. You see, when we're coming out of our universities today, we're not, it's an afterthought to think about students from linguistically diverse backgrounds. They should be included in all teacher education programs, because everybody will work with a student that comes from a linguistically diverse background. So as we work with our universities, and we work with our school leaderships, and we work with our communities, don't forget our families and our community partners, but we have to have our goals aligned, and the right hand has to talk to the left hand. And we're all, as I said, language and literacy teachers. So our teachers need the time to collaborate, to analyze, what the children are, presenting each and every day, and teams of people working together. Before I really started this work, I was in the medical field, in head trauma rehabilitation. We had something called grand rounds. This is our interdisciplinary team. These are our team members every day. How's the student doing? How are we coming along? What are we going to do next? That was so important, because we all knew our mutual goals. We had goals for our children. We had goals that everybody worked on together, and we really prioritized those goals. So we have to have the leadership team in the know. We have to have our teachers in the know, our parents and our family. Our student is a part of that team, and we have to be taking that time to collaborate. And oftentimes we don't want to be working in silos, and the teams that do this the best are the teams that have that solidified collaboration, and where they are thinking about each and every student. And our teachers have so much knowledge that they are becoming very diagnostic and prescriptive in their teaching. And so there's so many layers, but we've got to work with all those layers to make it happen. And so now when we do our work, as we have some what are called model demonstration, these are the research projects that we're involved in today. It's in the classrooms, working with the schools, working with the school leaders, but we don't do anything without the school leaders there right alongside, so everyone's in the know.
Wonderful, Magali. Yeah.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with Elsa that what we really need to have is an opportunity to address the entire ecosystem in terms of local, state, and classroom and school level policy and practices that build teacher and leader expertise. What we're really also talking about is a differentiated approach to offering the first best instruction to ELs, with a focus on knowing who they are looking at what their needs for language and literacy development are, and also addressing the central differentiated question about what's necessary to support their success in the classroom. Teachers, of course, are at the heart of this. I agree with Claude in terms of looking at the practice of teaching reading, but they can't do it alone. If we take a landscape view of looking at the federal and state policies, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Lau versus Nichols, which underscored the importance of staying on course and looking at the Supreme Court decision that equal treatment does not equal equitable opportunities for English learners. So it's that at the heart that state and district and site school leaders can support teachers of English learners by intentional design, by intentional implementation, by intentional and knowledge and research-based curricular instructional programs that are consultative with families. I appreciate the fact that we want to encourage the fact that children don't come to school. Knowing who your students are is also, when you're a teacher of a young child, knowing who their families are, knowing what their resources, their needs, and their strengths are, and connecting that more tightly to the instructional program to really support their success in school. We also need to continue to look at that information as we're learning about the students, to look at classroom-based data to support English learners' ongoing success. I'm a very big believer in formative assessments. These are not necessarily tests, but really assessments that are informed by amazing scholars like Margaret Heritage and Allison Bailey, that says, how do we look at the formative components of oral language and literacy development of our English learners? Because the tests don't come soon enough. Those formative assessment practices help us know how well we're doing in terms of the comprehensive language delivery in our classroom, and what adjustments can we make along the way to ensure success. I also want to underscore the fact that teachers should be treated as professionals and not as technicians to really deliver a narrow program of instruction, but really use the professional wisdom, preparation, building, and moving on to professional development once they get into a school system, so that when we design a high quality program of professional learning for teachers of English learners that center English learners in terms of the supports that they receive, to give them and provide them the tools and the time to have that consultative program to really support the way that they're effectively delivering English language development, providing comprehensive programs of oral language development and reading instruction to ensure that English learners are successful.
Fantastic. We have one more question in the regular portion here. So if folks are holding on to any questions that they've been pondering, now is a really good time to go ahead and put that in the Q&A so that we can queue it up for our Q&A session that we'll have right after this. And this last question, I want to hear from everybody. We'll do this a little bit lightning round style. Everyone's been given just a little bit shorter time than they've had to answer these questions. But Claude, we're going to start with you. And the question is, many states have or are working on legislation or regulations around literacy instruction, with new rules around curriculum adoption, instructional approaches, and or teacher education. What should we be looking for in those policies to ensure equitable learning opportunities for English learners and emergent bilinguals?
Sorry, I lost the microphone. Yeah, no, that's of course a great question. The $64 million question that we're just going to touch very lightly. Maybe the campaign would like to have a whole webinar devoted to that, but I'll just put in a pitch for that. As many of you probably know, and in fact, there was a question in the Q&A I was just looking at, there has been a bill introduced in California. Martha, I'm sure, knows about it. People from outside of California might not know. AB 2222 Rubio, California Kids Read. And I was just looking at the summary that the California Reading Coalition put out. One thing that's very clear is that ELs or EBs or MLs, have got to be part of the legislative language. That they've got to be acknowledged as a population, or actually populations, of students that have to be addressed as part of the policies. And the legislation does that. Talk about the literacy skills, language skills, English language development. But the problem is, and I'm going to kind of hedge my bets here, it's not very specific. It talks about the unique needs of the English learners. Well, what are those unique needs? And a lot will depend on not only the implementation legislation, but how the Department of Education then turns that into active policies. So we can put things like English learners and their unique needs and culturally and linguistically responsive instruction in the legislation. But that's just a start. I mean, that's just to get your foot in the door. The real issue is, what are the specifics? What actually are you looking at? And to revert back to a point I made before, what are the commonalities that we need to build on for all learners? And then what are the things that are specific to English learners and other populations of students that we need to make sure we address successfully? So while I look at this as sort of a half glass full, a glass half full and half empty. The half full part is they're being attended to. They're acknowledged. They're not sort of in the back room waiting for someone to pay attention. But the empty part is, well, what are the specifics? How are we actually going to address these issues in other than just sort of vague, superficial language? That's always my concern.
And Martha, we mentioned the California bill. I don't know if you want to talk more about that, but what should we be looking for in policy?
Well, current policies, first of all, must be, enhanced and modified to include and go beyond the 5 components, with a focus on oral language development, tied to interesting content, to tap and build content, background knowledge, and comprehension for all students. So policy should also include writing. New policies and programs really need, as Claude mentioned, to center the needs of English learners as a requirement for adoption and not add them as an addendum, including English learners without, as Claude said, going into the specifics. ELD has to be integrated into professional development and curriculum and actually differentiating for English proficiency levels and the asset of the student's primary language. Policies and professional development and curriculum need to address bilingualism and biliteracy. We said it before that emergent bilingual students have better outcomes in biliteracy settings. So perhaps their enrollment in dual language biliteracy settings should be prioritized. And then literacy blocks should be sufficient to deliver a high quality program that leaves space in the day for science, social studies, the arts, physical education, etc. And we need, as everyone has agreed, to build teacher capacity, but really to understand the research on language and literacy for English learners and aligning instructional practices with that research. And we have to consider students in dual language and biliteracy settings. They need to be included, and they have specific needs, and this would include, of course, primary language instructional materials. And I saw something in the chat that, yes, when we build teacher capacity and a teacher is teaching in a dual language setting, that perhaps that professional development could be provided in English, yes, but also in the target language of, of the program that the teachers are teaching. Otherwise, teachers have to translate everything. And as you know, translation does not work. And so those are a few things that I think we would need to focus on in terms of legislation and new policies.
Thanks, Martha. Magali, yeah.
Well, I think that Martha did a really great summary of the what we should be looking for in those policies. But I also think of the how. The how is that I think each person here in this webinar space has a personal and collective opportunity to advocate to ensuring that the what's in those policies, the content of the policy is included in the legislative language, but also to looking at what we want to avoid in those policies. So avoiding some of the narrow limitations, the expanded number of minutes, and looking at the language for a comprehensive view. We want to avoid narrow policy implementations such as what we've had in the past. We know those investments did not pay off. Those policies did not pay off. The second is we also want to advocate for ensuring that all young children, including English learners, of course, emergent bilinguals, have this opportunity to have joyful learning experiences in school as part of their language and literacy development. All of the content that you heard today, all of the information about what are the components of those comprehensive language and literacy programs, how do we use the research, the neuroscience to build out those synapses and the brain power that young children and young bilinguals have. Also underscore the importance for having children have opportunities to have access to books, to real literature, to authentic and culturally and linguistically represented resources in their classrooms. So I want to just underscore that part as well.
Great.
And I'd like to add a little bit to that. And Martha, I'm going to say a little bit something like kind of adding to what you were saying. But, I want to say that all instructors are language and literacy teachers. And so I'm affiliated with the University of Houston. We have the cecilcenter.org really looking at and have some papers published on math and science and social studies on how important it is for this population of students that we incorporate and embed the language and literacy skills as we're learning the content areas. And so working with teachers in middle school and now at the Center for Success of English Learners in high school, and really seeing how all through the day the children are getting opportunities for language development, literacy development, and content area development. And the more closely we align what those specific goals and targets are all across the day to all the team members, the greater the impact we're going to have with the students. And teachers teach. And so these kind of policies that we have need to really focus on the teachers as a profession, right? And as as a speech language pathologist, we more came from the medical model to where when we're in that university system, we are really thinking about all those diverse learners and all those potential kind of skills that we need to have. We practice them in the clinic, we practice them. Then we have to spend another year demonstrating under the mentorship of an expert that we can implement, passing those standards. And so we also need to make sure that our universities are prepared to teach us, because all universities need to be prepared to work with these pre-service teachers on what's, who's going to help these students. It's a fast growing population. We need universities to be prepared, and they need to be accredited to prepared, and not only show me what you've written down. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. No, you demonstrate to us, just like we demonstrate as teachers, as professionals, that we demonstrate we have the how, like Magali's talking about the how you do this work. And that's what we need more of, the how. And so I do agree, and I really think that teachers teach, and like Magali was saying, they are professionals, and we have to raise those thinking teachers that can think critically, that can differentiate that instruction, know what to do, when to do, why they do, and how they do.
And Carrie, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. So I'll just start out by saying that I have worked at a state education agency, and I support a community of practice of state education literacy leaders. They're incredible people. And one thing that I learned right away when I started working at the Rhode Island Department of Education is that folks often think that a state Department of Education has a lot more power and influence than they do. We can write all of the guidance that we want, but who actually sits there and reads it, right? It's like a car manual or refrigerator, right? There's not a lot of people that are actually going to read it and adhere to it. So they contend with local control, just like higher ed has to think about academic freedom. So they can be really influenced, schools and higher ed can be influenced by peers, by social media, by educational influencers, I'll call them, by publishers. So sometimes I think this legislation and these regulations are necessary in order to give our students and teachers what they need. So you asked about the legislation that requires high quality curriculum. I know that that's been very popular in a lot of states. I think it can definitely be helpful, but you have to be careful what you are looking to when you are adopting these lists, right? Let's not just go for an organization that may not have a direct link to a rubric, to the scientific evidence, to the research. Also, if we're only looking at alignment to standards, that may not be all that we need to address. I am also personally skeptical of review organizations that name suggested curricula. I wonder if that's a conflict of interest. So helpful, but proceed with caution. And also, I like what Martha said, that there are not a lot of instructional materials in the student's primary language that are reviewed, right? Like materials that can be used in dual language settings. So stay tuned to the Reading League social media for updates about that issue. Regarding the legislation that is most often developed to building knowledge, I think that's really important. If you can't tell, big fan of knowledge building, particularly when it's comprehensive and written by experts. We have a policymaker page on the Reading League Compass that has links to some expert organizations that can be leveraged. I say it can be helpful because the training, it provides information that's new to educators. We definitely need to know the how, but we do still need to build our knowledge in some of that what Claude talks about, how our brain turns language into print, the frameworks, instructional approaches that are aligned or misaligned. It builds knowledge in the structure of the language, which again is not something that a lot of educators received in their ed prep programs. The reciprocal role of reading and spelling, reading comprehension and writing, of what the heck morphology and syntax are, which I love both very much, and the increasingly important role that we're coming to understand from research that they play in comprehension, particularly comprehension for English learners and emergent bilingual students. It's fascinating. So I think building this knowledge is only good for students. It leads to student success, which is a large part of that joy that we're looking for in the classroom. And in this training, we have to look for what my colleagues have said: research on supporting English learner, emergent bilingual students, the essential role of English language development, research on dual language instruction, resources on contrastive analysis to leverage the assets of the language that the student brings into the classroom. And the same with understanding the rules-based dialectical variations that should be honored and valued that students bring into the classroom. But it has to be a yes and, right? We can't say, no, we don't want this legislation because it doesn't include this. It's yes, we see the value of understanding the what and the how, and we want to also make sure that the needs of these students are taken into consideration, right? Not to just attack and push down these empowering trainings that give the teachers the tools they need to help students, right? Here's my little metaphor to end on: is let's all paddle in the same direction. We can exchange our oars of knowledge, help one another out, communicating the whole time, trusting those in our canoe. I see you all in my canoe, because then we can only, Claude's laughing at me, we can turn the tide of literacy for our students. I talk in metaphors. Thanks.
What better way to exemplify the rich literacy of our well-educated students than to speak in metaphor, which I also really like to do. So I appreciate that. I really want to thank our panelists for just bringing together these incredibly important ideas and being very clear and providing information. I've been seeing in the chat, everyone saying yes, 100%. And I think everything that you've been saying has been really resonating. And we have some terrific questions from the listeners and viewers, and I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. We do have about 20 minutes left, so that should be a pretty good amount of time to get through many of these questions. A couple of the questions have to do with a question that we just started with, or close to the beginning of the session, around the science of reading as a package. And a lot of teachers have said, I'm being told I have to follow this package with fidelity. I have to follow this curriculum. I'm being told what to teach and in what order. And I'm sure that a number of you want to answer this. I want to maybe go to Elsa first, who dwells with me in the what's happening on the ground. What do we say to teachers or administrators who are in classrooms where they're being told you have to do this for a certain amount of time in a certain way?
Right. And so, how we work around that, because I mean, it's very difficult to change. This is a mandate. That's why we have to work with leadership teams. But here's what we do. We come in and we actually look at what do we have here and where are those opportunities for the language supports and
Uh-oh, I hope it's not me. Somebody else on the panel wanna, yeah, okay. I'm gonna go ahead. I was gonna go to Martha next. Let's hear what Martha has to say, and then we'll come back to Elsa. Hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us.
And so, and the question being, when, the fidelity issue. And I think I've said it many times, that we need to respond to the needs of students, and it has to be differentiated. I just heard Linda Diamond speaking about how we need to teach using small group instruction, right? And that in small group instruction, you get to know your students, and that you are able to kind of be differentiate for their needs. And so how can you follow a scripted program and meet the needs of your diverse learners? And so we've been saying that the teacher is the key. We cannot take away teacher efficacy, and to teacher decision making, because teachers are the ones that know their students best. And so again, I kind of feel like those kind of scripted programs really are not aligned with what the research indicates would provide effective instruction for anybody, including emergent bilingual students.
Carrie, you unmuted. You want to add something?
Yeah, just to briefly mention that I absolutely agree. And, I've written many times that, we need to use data to inform instruction. This is not a one size fits all program. But I do think that there needs to be some flexibility in thinking, because there are some programs that have some scripts to adhere to kind of get educators used to perhaps a new approach, and they have a lot of data to support their approach. For example, I just heard somebody reporting from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I believe it's called, and their large scale study of how their direct instruction program really elevated literacy outcomes in a native population. So I do think that we can't just abolish all like the thought that we can't do anything that is scripted, because there is data to support that in some programs.
I think you're talking about like instructional routines, which is, I think, different than, a whole class lesson, right? Without responding to the needs of the students. But I agreed, Carrie.
Let's hear from Claude, and then Magali. I want to hear from you, and I want to add one thing to when you reply. Claude.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think this is, someone put in the Q&A what were some areas of that we didn't, find agreement, not necessarily disagreement, but, and I think, in the joint statement I'm referring to, and I think this is one of them. I mean, this is as so many things are, this is a complex question, because in point of fact, there is some evidence that following a script or following a protocol actually, as Carrie said, helps implement new practices when people aren't really comfortable with them. At the same time, people are not automatons. They're not robots. You can't program them to do exactly what you want to do. So it's a delicate balance. And I don't know where we should land on that continuum. But I will suggest that I mean, I agree with Carrie that you can't just sort of blanketly say you cannot use scripting. You want to use it when it's necessary, when it's indicated. And I would even say when there's some evidence to suggest that it actually helps implement new practices. So I just think we should be careful and cautious about saying you can't use scripting, because in point of fact, there is some evidence to suggest it can be very helpful.
Great. And Magali, I want to hear what you wanted to say. And then also, if this wasn't what you were going to say, I'd love you to add about bilingual programs, specifically dual language programs, often feel especially uncomfortable about packages that are bought by districts because they don't come in the partner language, or it doesn't really work to try to teach it in two languages. So if you could add something about how all of this works in dual language, especially, that would be terrific.
Yeah, the first point is going to be connected to the second question that you have, and that is what is the role of, like, in the olden days, we call them a basal reading program, right? There is a role for them, but it shouldn't be the sole instructional program anywhere. And I think there's a lot of research and findings that we found from highly scripted programs that they were not effective for anybody when we had No Child Left Behind and Reading First and those kind of very highly scripted, narrow curriculum, which did not have effects. I think we need to differentiate and define our terms. And then when we apply this conversation to bilingual dual language programs, when you have you have not considered the design of dual language programs in the allocation of time over the course of the day for English language development, which is part of the design of a dual language program. And when you overly mandate time for some of the narrow concepts that Marta was referring to earlier, when we have seen that happen in some places where there are many minutes allocated for phonics or many minutes allocated for following a narrow script, that does a disservice and interrupts the dual language program, which we know are highly effective. And we heard that from teachers, that the interruptions caused by these mandates really are detrimental to biliteracy development, to the flow and design of those programs that we know from research have been highly effective for English emergent bilingual students.
Great. We don't have Elsa back yet, unfortunately. I hope we'll get her back, but we can go on to another question. And several of these questions I especially want to hear from Elsa, so I'm trying to jump over to some of these other ones.
She's back.
Here.
Oh, yay! Well, I'll let you, since we just finished the little bit on the materials, materials that come scripted or professional development programs being limiting. And if you just in 30 seconds, since you didn't hear some of the other.
Yeah, just this is how I guide teachers. I say, first of all, know your purpose. Know about the language and the linguistic supports that you need to get, those language and verbal supports. Know your stuff, right? And get rid of the fluff. That's what Anita Archer always says. But here's the thing, we get a lot of stuff, but it's really getting to the point. And I think in the future, we will see that, linguistically diverse students will be at the very center, and hopefully they'll do better. But that's why the professional is so important. And so incorporating what we know, that we need to work on the language and the literacy as we move along. And let's build in the good practices, the evidence practices that we have about language and about literacy into what you're doing. And you can do this throughout the day, building language and literacy.
Great. We're super glad that you're back, because the next question I wanted to ask, I wanted to start with you.
Okay.
So is about assessment. We have a question about universal screeners. And we didn't really get a chance to talk about this in the initial part, but
so,
tell us about.
I have some exciting things to share with you today. And the excitement comes as this, and I know it's so, it's so scary. AI is scary, and technology is scary. But what we need, what the future holds for that, and kind of the different teams that are working on. There's a bunch of teams working on the future, and the future is this. That this is the future. We'll no longer have, oh, this is how they look in that language. This is how they look in that language. This is how literacy. No. That we will truly have this wonderful, wonderful tools at our fingertips that will really demonstrate the children and who they really are. They're not two. I'm not an English speaker and a Spanish speaker. I'm a bilingual, biliterate individual. And so that means that we are, in this, we're getting better and better at that speech to text recognition. So we'll get better and better at conceptual scoring. We're getting better and better. Whatever the student is going to respond, we're going to be able to tally, like, oh, that was a response in their language. We get credit for that. And this is how they do it. And this is what they know. So really looking at the whole child, that's what the future holds. And it is a little scary as we see, like, oh, AI and what it's learning from us. But currently, what do we have in place? And what we have in place there are some tools out there and some future tools. And the bottom line is these students we have to have enough of these students in our in our normative data sets, right? And this is the other thing I'm pushing for. And I know that we can do this. We need, like everything that I do, when I assess a child, guess what? I know the family, I know where they come from, I know all the developmental history of the child, what they've been exposed to. Why can't we collect that to really get a comprehensive approach of who is this child in front of us? And so now the screenings, we have them looking at things. They don't look enough at language. We look at if you look at literacy screenings, they have, some on the early skills like PA and looking at letter sound, the things that predict, the phonological awareness predicts future, the letter sound knowledge predicts future, but also what predicts future is your language ability, your language proficiency does. And so you can't do that work without having language proficiency there. But what the future holds is really looking at the truly bilingual, biliterate child and really giving them credit for who they are and what they know, and not saying, oh, this is a deficit. No, it's not a deficit, it's an asset. They already have this conceptualization. They just need new labels.
And I just want to stay on this issue of digital. There's a couple other questions on digital issues. Claude, would you say that read-along text where words are highlighted while being heard helps build the literacy circuit in multilingual learners?
Probably not, because what really builds that circuit, as I understand it, is attention not just to whole words, but the letters and sounds within the words, the orthographic representations of individual sounds and how they combine in written form and orally to connect to meaning. So if you're just looking at whole words and kids are following along, now I have no objection to that kind of activity, but as far as building that neural circuitry, I don't believe that will accomplish that.
We just have a couple minutes left. Oh, and the engagement poll has just come up. If folks could go ahead and fill that out, our hosts would love to hear from you. Oops, sorry, let me get back to my page where my information is. There we go. Another very specific question. An attendee is curious, and Magali, I wonder if you might be able to address this. An attendee is curious whether there's specific research about the best approach to teach high frequency words to English learners. Should we focus on frequency, Frey-Dolch lists, focus on sound by common phonemes, or teach high frequency words by topic or content, or a combination of all of those? So, we've been talking a lot about the sound spelling correspondence, and this is really looking more at high frequency words. So if you could tell us a little bit about what you know about that.
Well, I think that you have to differentiate the high frequency words for English learners versus for native English speakers. And there's very limited research that really speaks to that. And I'll give you an example of my own learning experiences. That obviously it's an anecdotal story of one. But when I was an English learner in kindergarten through 4th grade, that was the approach to reading that I had. I really didn't learn to read until I was in 4th grade because the approach was looking at memorizing the fluency, the high frequency word counts. They were out of context for me, so they really had no meaning. So back to this whole conversation of how do we design, how do we help our leaders, our systems, our school sites, our teams, as Elsa said, design a comprehensive program for oral language and literacy development for English learners. Might there be a role for high frequency words out of context? Perhaps, but not unless it's very clearly defined and explicit for the learners as well, because listening to and memorizing and using the Dolch list, for example, are decontextualized for the youngest English learners that we're talking about here.
We just have about 1 minute before I'm going to pass it back to Hattie. So Martha and Carrie, I want to give you, so you had the opening word. I'm going to give you the last word. What bright spots have you all seen come out of the collaborative efforts over the last few years? Maybe Carrie, we'll start with you, and then Martha can bring us home.
Oh, good. Thank you. I didn't want that responsibility. I just think that it's really neat how this conversation is continuing, and it's, you know, it's really one that is helping us to ask questions and respond and grow our knowledge together. And that, you know, the joint statement in particular is being used just as much within NCEL as it is within the reading science world. I think it's a really cool structure and some great outcomes that we've had there.
Great. And Martha?
And well, I want to echo what Carrie said, but also, you know, I have seen and heard messaging change among researchers and even the media and blogs echoing aspects of the joint statement. And so that really, you know, I mean, it's just a small thing, it's a small little step, but it really makes me feel like there is, even though it's slow, that there is a change in the narrative, that the narrative is changing, that the science of reading is, you know, encompassing all, you know, research that includes multilingual learners. But we have a long way to go, you know, with all of the misconceptions and the myths surrounding the science of reading. So if there's a
Well,
bite.
that's an excellent note to end on. I want to thank the panelists so much. This has been really brilliant, and I think that the audience really got a lot out of it, judging from the amazing comments that we've had. And at this point, I want to turn it back to Hattie to close out the session.
I also want to say thank you to you, Julie, for moderating. You did an amazing job getting us through all of the questions that we had, trying to cover so much in just a 90-minute webinar. Thanks again to the panelists for joining and participating today and sharing your expertise and your work. Thank you to everyone who attended. It's so great to see such an active chat. And I'm sorry for those of you whose questions we didn't get to. The wonderful thing about having so many people on is that there are a lot of questions, but we did what we could. Thanks again to everyone, and just a reminder of our upcoming sessions that you can see on the screen here. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Hattie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity. Take care.
Sure. Bye.
Same to you all.
Bye.
Thanks.